Leroy Weston Gault showed up every Tuesday at Cedar Ridge Municipal Golf Course the same way he showed up for everything in his life: early, quiet, and without any expectation of welcome. He drove a 2003 Silverado with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat permanently lowered to accommodate the golf bag he carried since 1984. The bag was canvas, forest green, worn pale at the strap where 40 years of friction had eaten the color away. The clubs inside were Ping Eye 2 irons, the kind of set most serious golfers had retired to their garages before the Clinton administration. The grips on the 5-iron and the 7-iron had been rewrapped twice with black electrical tape. He'd never seen a reason to change them. The woman at the pro shop counter, a 22-year-old named Brianna who'd been working weekends and Tuesday shifts since spring, had stopped trying to upsell him the premium cart rental 8 months ago. Leroy Gault walked the course. He always walked. He paid his green fee in cash, exact change, $17, took a single paper scorecard he never filled out, and made his way to the first tee by 6:45, before the heat came up and the families with strollers started drifting in from the parking lot. He was 74 years old. He wore a faded army green windbreaker with no patches, no insignia, no name tape, not because he'd forgotten them, but because he'd removed them deliberately, one by one, sometime in the winter of 2002. On his left wrist was a watch that hadn't been accurate since 2019 and still kept. He didn't correct it. He knew what time it was by other means, the way some people always do. The regulars at Cedar Ridge knew him the way you know the furniture in a waiting room. He was just there, quiet, courteous when spoken to. He'd tip his hat to the groundskeepers and call them by name: Terry on mow days, Robert on the irrigation crew, and they'd nod back with the unspoken respect one working man offers another. Beyond that, nobody knew much about Leroy Gault. He never talked about himself. He never complained about the pace of play, never offered unsolicited advice, never lingered at the clubhouse bar after the round. He signed his name in the tea time book every Tuesday at 6:45 and was gone by 11, his half-eaten granola bar in the trash by the exit, his bag already loaded before most players had finished the back nine. Nobody knew why he came every Tuesday specifically. Nobody thought to ask. The Tuesday that changed everything arrived in late September, when the red maples along the 11th fairway had just begun to turn, and the morning air still carried that thin edge of warmth that passes for autumn in North Carolina. Cedar Ridge was hosting what the course manager, Phil Dancy, had billed as a community showcase round, an informal event attached to a regional sponsorship pitch from a golf equipment company called Apex Tour. The centerpiece of the event was Austin Merritt. Austin Merritt was 28 years old and had the kind of face that photographed well from every angle which he was aware of and made no effort to disguise his awareness of. He'd been a Division I golfer at Clemson, missed his PGA Tour card by 3 strokes at Q School 2 years running, and had since reinvented himself as a golf content creator with 400,000 followers across his platforms. His deal with Apex Tour was contingent on one deliverable: break the Cedar Ridge course record of 9 under par, set in 1999 by a journeyman tour pro named Gerald Foss during a charity event, and post the round in real time for a combined audience. Apex would supply custom clubs, a branded caddy bib, and a 2-year equipment contract. All Austin needed was one clean, historic round. He arrived at 8:15 with a caddy named Blake, who wore sunglasses on the back of his head, a camera operator named Jess, who kept repositioning herself around the tee boxes to find better light, and 2 college friends who functioned as an audience. He had a rangefinder, a launch monitor tucked into his bag, and a set of irons that had been custom fitted at a $350 session in Charlotte. He shook Phil Dancy's hand with the practiced warmth of someone who'd done media training, and proceeded to take over the putting green with the easy authority of a man who assumed all spaces were waiting for him to arrive. Leroy Gault was already on the second fairway when Austin Merritt teed off on hole 1. The round that day unfolded across 2 separate universes. Austin's universe was loud with the click of tracking software and the low murmur of Blake's yardage calculations, punctuated by Jess repositioning and the occasional cheer when a shot landed close. He was genuinely gifted. That much was undeniable. His iron play was crisp and penetrating, his putting stroke rhythmic and unhurried. By the time he reached the 7th hole, he was 4 under, right on the pace he needed. His followers were watching the live stream. The comments scrolled faster than anyone could read them. Leroy's universe was quieter. Just the sound of his old canvas bag over one shoulder, the soft crush of damp fairway grass under his walking shoes, the occasional crow calling from the tree line beyond the 9th green. Jonah Rees, the 19-year-old cart attendant working the back nine, had started following Leroy at a respectful distance around the 10th hole. Not assigned to him, just watching. There was something about the way the old man moved through the course. Unhurried, but not slow. Deliberate without being stiff, like someone who had made peace with every step before he took it. When Leroy selected a club, he didn't pull the rangefinder or check an app. He looked at the flag, looked at the trees for wind, looked at the sky once, and pulled the club. That was all. Jonah had been working at Cedar Ridge for 2 summers and had watched hundreds of rounds from the cart path. He'd never seen anyone select a club that fast and be that consistently right about it. He mentioned it to Glen Arroyo on the cart path turnaround near the 12th green. Glen Arroyo was 67, a retired civil engineer who played Cedar Ridge 3 times a week and had been doing so for 19 years. He'd seen every kind of golfer come through. He looked where Jonah pointed, at the old man in the green windbreaker, lining up a 190-yard approach to the 12th pin, and something crossed Glen's face that Jonah couldn't quite name. Not recognition, not yet, just attention. The kind of attention a person pays when something rings a bell they can't quite place. "How's he scoring?" Glen asked. Jonah had been keeping informal track, even through 11, he said, but clean, really clean. Glen watched Leroy hit the approach. The ball climbed high, held its line against a left-to-right breeze that had been giving everyone else trouble all morning, and landed soft 12 feet right of the pin. It released forward and stopped 8 feet from the cup. Glen let out a slow breath through his nose. "Who is he?" Glen asked. "No idea," Jonah said. "He comes every Tuesday, never talks much." Glen nodded slowly, his eyes still on the old man. "Huh," he said, and that was all. By the time the 2 universes converged at the 16th tee box, Austin Merritt was 8 under through 15 holes. Blake had walked him through the math twice. To break the record, he needed to finish 3 under on the final 3 holes. An eagle somewhere or 2 birdies and an ace. The 16th was a par 3. Every regular at Cedar Ridge knew the 16th hole by its local name, the Widowmaker. 212 yards over a narrow pond to a green-guarded front left by a bunker that the grounds crew maintained with a kind of grim pride. The pin placement that Tuesday was tucked behind the bunker, accessible only by a high drawing shot that had to land soft and stop fast. In 24 years of recorded play at Cedar Ridge Municipal, no one had made a hole-in-one on the 16th. The ball had come close. Gerald Foss, in his record-setting round, had lipped out from 9 feet. 3 other players had hit the pin and bounced away. The cup on 16 was considered, among Cedar Ridge regulars, to be essentially inviolable. Austin stood on the tee box with his 7-iron, running the numbers with Blake. The launch monitor confirmed 212 yards was achievable at his current carry rate. Wind was southeast at 11 miles per hour, which Blake called a quarter cross, mostly in your face, slight left component. Austin made 2 practice swings, slower than his usual tempo, found the slot he wanted, and stepped in. Jess moved left for the better angle. Austin's followers were up to 412,000 by then live on the stream. The shot was excellent, genuinely excellent. The ball climbed into the morning sky with a piercing trajectory, held its shape through the wind, and landed 6 feet past the pin, checked twice, and released back to settle 11 feet from the cup. 11 feet from a hole-in-one. The small gallery that had gathered, Phil Dancy, Blake, Jess, the 2 friends, Jonah, Glen Arroyo, who had followed out of instinct, and a handful of Tuesday regulars who'd finished their own rounds and stayed to watch, gave a long, appreciative exhale. Not a hole-in-one, but as close as most people ever saw at Cedar Ridge. Austin smiled. It was a good smile, generous and real, untouched by the smirk he usually wore. He knew what he'd hit. He knew it was close. The moment hung there, complete and satisfying, and then it moved on the way moments do. Leroy Gault stepped onto the tee box. He'd been waiting at the back of the box while Austin played, standing the way he always stood. Still, hands loose at his sides, weight slightly forward on the balls of his feet. The posture wasn't casual exactly. It was more like a resting precision. Jonah noticed that Austin's friends had started to smirk, not cruelly, just reflexively, The way young men smirk when something they've pre-categorized confirms itself. "That's a rental bag," one of them said, just loudly enough. Leroy didn't look at him. He set his canvas bag down, unzipped it without rushing, and drew out the Ping-Ai 2.5 iron. Longer than the 7-iron Austin had chosen, which struck Glen Arroyo immediately as strange for the same distance, until the wind shifted a quarter beat, and Glen realized Leroy had already accounted for a gust that had not yet arrived. The old man stood to the side of the tee markers and looked at the hole, just looked at it, the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood before the first cut, not measuring, not calculating, but simply knowing. His head tilted almost imperceptibly to the right. Then he set up. His grip was textbook, not modern textbook, old textbook. The kind of grip you learned before video analysis existed, maintained because it worked and for no other reason. He took one practice motion, not a full swing, just a rotation, barely a quarterback, so slow and deliberate it was almost meditative. And then he stopped. He stood over the ball for 3 full seconds, absolute stillness. The swing, when it came, was not dramatic. That was the strange thing Jonah would describe to people for years afterward. It wasn't the theatrical explosion of speed he'd seen from good golfers, the aggressive uncoiling, the violent release. It was more like the ball was inevitable, like the club head had always been going to arrive at that exact point in space, at that exact moment, and the swing was merely gravity making it official. The sound was what stopped everyone, a pure ringing contact, not the sharp crack of a mishit, not the dull thud of a fat shot, but a clean bell tone that seemed too full for such a small ball, too resonant for such a quiet old man. The ball flew on a line that was lower than Austin's shot, more boring and less beautiful to the naked eye, the kind of trajectory that experienced players recognize as the work of someone who trusts compression over height, who prefers truth to spectacle. The ball hit the green 6 feet short of the pin. One bounce. It checked hard, the backspin biting into the Bermuda. The forward momentum died almost instantly. The ball tracked left, toward the hole, and for one impossible second the gallery was completely silent, watching something approach an outcome that the course had resisted for 24 years. The ball rolled into the cup. The cup accepted it. There was a delay, 2, maybe 3 seconds, where nobody said anything, the kind of silence that isn't quiet at all, that has weight and temperature and texture. Then Jonah Reese, 19 years old, working his second summer at Cedar Ridge Municipal, screamed. Not a word, just a sound, the kind that bypasses language entirely. Phil Dancy, the course manager, said, "Oh my Lord," in a voice that came from the back of his throat. Austin Merritt's 7-iron was still in his hand. He was staring at the green, at the hole, at the place where the ball had gone. His caddy Blake said something in his ear, and Austin didn't react, didn't turn, just stared. "Lucky shot," one of the friends started to say, and Glen Arroyo turned and looked at him, and the rest of the sentence never left the young man's mouth. Leroy Gault set his 5-iron back in the bag with the same unhurried precision with which he had taken it out. His face had not changed. Still that same quality of permanent gravity, the expression of a man who has processed enough of life's extremes to arrive at a kind of equanimity that others might mistake for detachment. He zipped the bag and shouldered it and began walking toward the 16th green. Austin fell into step beside him. "That's—" Austin stopped, started again. "I need you to explain to me what just happened." "I hit the ball," Leroy said. "It went in." "With a 5-iron from 212. "Wind was shifting," Leroy said. "Needed the lower flight." Austin walked beside him in silence for a moment. "Then who taught you to do that?" Leroy looked at him for the first time, not the quick, dismissing glance of someone who's decided the conversation isn't worth having, but a real look. "The army," he said, "and my wife." Glen Arroyo had dropped back at the edge of the fairway, his phone out, thumbs moving. He'd been trying to place it since the 12th hole, something about the posture, the stillness, the way the old man carried the bag. And when the name finally came to him, he'd opened a search with hands that had developed a slight tremble. Leroy Weston Gault. The results were not easy to find because the man had spent 4 decades ensuring they wouldn't be. But Glen had grown up in Fayetteville, 20 minutes from Fort Bragg. And his father had been Army, and some names you heard in certain circles, not as facts but as weather. Things that came through before you knew what to call them. the 5th Special Forces Group, Vietnam, 1968. Firebase Ripcord adjacent, a listening post called LP Kestrel, manned by 3 soldiers in the hills northwest of Hue, cut off during a North Vietnamese assault that overwhelmed the perimeter at 03 Hun. 1 man was killed in the opening minutes, 1 was wounded and could not move. The 3rd man held the post alone for 14 hours, directing artillery fire by radio, adjusting rounds onto his own position when the NVA came within 40 meters. The artillery saved 41 men inside the firebase. The man at LP Kestrel walked out at dusk, carrying his wounded partner on his back, and refused evacuation until every other casualty was cleared. He was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Citation. He declined the Silver Star the colonel recommended. He said there was nothing silver about what happened up there. He re-enlisted 3 more times. Gulf War, Kosovo. A 3rd deployment that remained classified above the level Glen could access on a phone in the middle of a golf course. He retired as Sergeant Major in 2001, moved to North Carolina to be near his wife's family after she fell ill. Eleanor Gault had died 4 years ago, ovarian cancer, in the spring when the red maples bloomed. Glen had 1 more search result open, a small item in a 1977 regional sports page, scanned and archived by a Fayetteville Historical Society. A box score from the Carolinas Mini Tour, a developmental circuit. A round of 64, 8 under par, by a 25-year-old Special Forces soldier on emergency leave who'd entered as an amateur, hadn't played a competitive round in 3 years, and finished 2 strokes behind the eventual winner. The name in the box score, Fort Bragg, NC. Glen looked up from his phone. His hands had stopped trembling, replaced by a different kind of stillness. The stillness of a man who has just understood something he didn't know he was missing. He walked to Phil Dancy, said 3 words. Phil's face went the colour of old plaster. By the time Leroy Gault finished the 17th hole, a clean par, the ball placed within 4 feet of the pin as though ordered there, Phil Dancy had made 2 phone calls, and word had begun to move through the Tuesday morning veteran community, the way word moves in tight communities, which is to say faster than light. The first car pulled into the Cedar Ridge parking lot before Leroy finished the 18th. By the time he completed his round and walked toward the bag drop, there were 11 vehicles he didn't recognize, and a group of men, most of them between 55 and 70, standing near the clubhouse entrance with the particular posture of people who have gathered for something they cannot quite name but feel compelled to attend. One of them stepped forward. He was in his late 60s, barrel-chested, wearing a Rotary Club jacket over a Fort Bragg retiree hat. Colonel Raymond Brevard, retired 5th Special Forces Group. He'd driven from Raleigh in 41 minutes. Leroy stopped walking when he saw them. He looked at the group with those dark, patient eyes, and something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, but a recognition that the Tuesday he'd been living inside for 4 years was about to end. "Sergeant Major Gault," Colonel Brevard said. Leroy set his bag down. "Raymond," he said. The colonel's voice cracked on the next sentence, and he let it. "My father was at Firebase Ripcord. It was one of the 41. He paused. He talked about you until the day he died. He said LP Kestrel was the reason he came home to us." He paused again. "I have 3 grandchildren." Leroy nodded slowly. "How is he?" "He passed in 2019, the colonel said, peacefully. "At home, the way he deserved." "I'm glad he made it back," Leroy said. His voice was still quiet, still carrying that quality of compression, everything held in, not repressed, but deliberately contained, the way a man who has survived more than his share learns to take up less space than his grief. "I'm glad for your grandchildren." The colonel straightened and saluted, a parade ground salute, precise and formal. Several of the men behind him did the same. Austin Merritt was standing at the edge of the group, holding his $350 custom-fitted 7-iron at his side like something he'd forgotten to put down. Jess had stopped filming. Blake was looking at the ground. The 2 friends were very still. Colonel Brevard turned. "You're Austin Merritt," he said. "It wasn't a question." Austin nodded. "Your grandfather," the colonel said, pulling a small worn photograph from his jacket pocket, the kind of thing a man carries for reasons he cannot fully explain, was Corporal Dennis Merritt. He was one of the wounded at Firebase Ripcord the night LP Kestrel held. Austin Merritt stared at the photograph. It was a young man in uniform, early 20s, the kind of face you'd see in a high school yearbook, if the high school yearbooks had been printed during a war. The resemblance was not subtle. "My grandfather never talked about Vietnam," Austin said quietly. "Most of them didn't," the colonel said. "But his daughter, your mother, she wrote to a veterans organization in 2004 asking if anyone knew what happened to him that night, how he survived." He looked at Leroy. "We found the after-action report 3 years later." Austin looked at Leroy Gault. Really looked the way he hadn't looked when the old man was just a retiree with a canvas bag and cracked grips on his clubs. "You saved my grandfather," Austin said. "I did what needed doing," Leroy said. "Same as he did. He held on for 14 hours with a femur fracture and never asked to be evacuated before the others. That takes something most people don't know they have until they're in it." He paused. "You have his jawline," he added, and it landed so quietly that Austin wasn't sure for a moment he'd heard it. Phil Dancy, the course manager, appeared from the clubhouse with a printed piece of paper and a look of determined ceremony. He had never, in 14 years of running Cedar Ridge Municipal Golf Course, expected to preside over a moment like this one, and he was determined to get it right. "We don't have a plaque ready," he said, addressing the gathered group with the earnestness of a man improvising at the altar. "That's going to take 2 weeks, and I'm going to pay for it myself. But I want to say it now, in front of witnesses. Hole 16 at Cedar Ridge is being renamed effective today." He looked at Leroy. "With your permission, Sergeant Major, we'd like to call it Eleanor's Hole, for your wife, because you told Jonah this morning that you come here every Tuesday, because Tuesday was her day, because this was your place together." He stopped, collected himself. "And because the first ace ever recorded there should belong to the man who carries her with him every time he walks this course." Leroy stood very still. Jonah Reese, the 19-year-old cart attendant who had been watching all of this from the bag drop with his mouth slightly open, would later say that in that moment the old man in the green windbreaker looked like someone who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and had just, for the first time in years, been offered a place to set it down. "Eleanor would have said the hole doesn't belong to either of us," Leroy said finally. His voice was steady but held something underneath, the way a floor holds weight you can't see. "She would have said it belongs to everyone who plays it with their whole self." He looked at the green in the middle distance, at the 16th flag moving gently in the late morning breeze. "But she'd have been glad for the recognition. She was always more comfortable with it than I was." The small ceremony extended the way such things do when nobody wants to be the first to leave. Veterans exchanged handshakes and stories. Jonah asked Glen Arroyo to explain what he'd found on his phone, and Glen talked for 15 minutes. And Jonah stood and listened and did not speak because there was nothing adequate to say. Phil Dancy ordered sandwiches from the clubhouse kitchen, and nobody objected. Austin Merritt found Leroy sitting alone on the bench at the 16th tee box, looking out over the pond, a half-eaten granola bar in his hand. He sat down beside him without asking, which he would later recognize as something his grandfather might have done. "Can I ask you something?" Austin said. Leroy nodded. "When you stood over that ball before the swing," Austin looked for the right words. "Where were you?" Leroy was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about Eleanor," he said. "She used to caddy for me. Before the kids, before she got sick, when we were young and didn't have anything except time and a shared bag of clubs we'd bought second-hand." He turned the granola bar over in his hands. "She had this thing," she said. "Every time I'd get tight before a shot, she'd put her hand on my arm and say, 'You already know how to do this. Stop thinking about the outcome and remember why you love the doing.'" He paused. "I hear her say it every time I stand over the ball." Austin Merritt's expensive round of golf, the live stream, the sponsorship pitch, the equipment contract, had technically ended without the course record he needed. He'd finished the round at 8 under, 1 short. He would have to tell Apex Tour. He would have to rethink the strategy, reschedule, reload. None of that was present in his mind at this moment. "I've been golfing since I was 9 years old," Austin said slowly. "I've never thought about why I love it. I've only ever thought about what it could get me." Leroy looked at him with an expression that was neither judgment nor pity, just recognition. "You have time," he said. "You're young, and now you know to ask the question." "Will you?" Austin stopped. "Would you play with me next Tuesday?" "Not for the camera, not for the sponsorship. I just want to play around with you and hear more about her." Leroy considered him for a moment. the way he considered things, fully without pretense of quickness. "Okay," said, "but you're going to carry your own bag, and we play at 6:45 because that's when the course is still honest." Austin nodded. 6:45. "And you'll bring your grandfather's picture," Leroy said. "I'd like to look at him again." The following Tuesday, Leroy Weston Gault arrived at Cedar Ridge Municipal Golf Course at 6:42 and found two people waiting at the first tee. Austin Merritt was there with a carry bag, mid-range, borrowed, nothing with a logo on it. Beside him stood a man in his early 60s, with Austin's jawline and tired, grateful eyes, who put out his hand when Leroy approached. "My name is Dennis Merritt Jr., the man said. "I'm his father, and I've been trying to find a way to say thank you for 58 years. Leroy shook his hand and held it for a moment. "Your father was a good soldier," he said. "A better man. It was an honor to serve alongside him, even for one night." Dennis Merritt's voice failed him. He nodded, which said everything it needed to. They walked the course together that morning, three men with unequal years and unequal histories, and a game that asks the same thing of all of them: patience, honesty, and a willingness to be present in the space between what you intended and what actually happened. On the 16th tee, there was a small temporary placard, hand-lettered by Phil Dancy on cardstock, laminated in the pro shop, that read Eleanor's hole, first ace, Sergeant Major Leroy W. Gault, USMC Ret, a record that belongs to so play with their whole self. Leroy stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. Then he unzipped the canvas bag, pulled out the Ping Eye 2.5 iron, electrical tape on the grip, worn pale at the toe from 40 years of the same practiced draw, and looked out at the flag. His hands were perfectly steady. They always were, once he had something worth protecting in front of him.